Chapter 9, The Confederation and the Constitution, 1776 to 1790. So this chapter, even though it says 1776, we're talking post-Revolutionary War. This chapter is all about the Articles of Confederation and how they didn't work, the need for a constitution, the writing of the Constitution, the final passage and adoption of the Constitution. So you can imagine it's a pretty darn important chapter, and we'll be covering the Constitution test and a lecture over the Constitution in the aftermath of Chapter 9. So I included this picture in here because this really is the birth of the Industrial Revolution in America. This picture's from your book, and it shows what women did for a large portion of their day in most of the villages around America during this time period. They're weaving. So they're turning cotton or wool. This is the time period prior to the invention of the cotton gin, so it's mostly wool. They're turning these clumps of textiles into yarn. Right, those are those strings that you see on there. And then they're using the yarn, and several strands of yarn. They're using a loom, and that's actually what you're seeing right here. This would be the loom. And through just painstaking process, weaving the strands together, they're making cloth. This is a very slow, cumbersome process, but once they start coming up with machines that can do this, and they're not powered by electricity yet, they're not powered by coal or steam even, they're originally powered by water power, where you would have basically these belts up here turning because of a water wheel. You'll see later on in another chapter a better picture of this happening. But this is the birthplace, really, of the Industrial Revolution. There's two waves of Industrial Revolution that occur in America. The first wave is almost solely textiles, and it happens in the early 1800s. And then the second wave is where you get the railroads and the steel and the electricity and all the stuff that we think of, like the factory setting. That happens in the latter half of the 1800s. Alright, so the first section, the pursuit of equality. So we kind of talked about this a little bit in the Zinn-Schweikart discussion with the state constitutions. Post-revolution, most states either reduced the property holding requirements for voting, or the vocab term is suffrage, and there's even, I believe, one or two states that abolished property holding requirements altogether. You have to remember, though, these were just property holding requirements for white males. So if you were of any type of color, there's still no suffrage for you, and if you're a woman, you don't get to vote until 1920. The Anglican Church, which was the Church of England, and that was the official church of most of the colonies, the Americans disestablished it. So they basically attacked it because it was a vestige of the old British Empire. But the church itself is reborn, and it renames itself as the Protestant Episcopal Church. So to this day, the Episcopal Church can trace its roots, or its origination, to the Anglican Church, which really was the Congregational Church of the Puritans and all that other stuff. Several northern states abolished slavery or provided for gradual emancipation. The South did not, although in this time period slavery was slowly dying, and there was a lot of talk in places like Virginia and the Carolinas about gradual emancipation. And what the book and what historians mean by gradual emancipation is that someone would give money to the slave owners so that they would free their slaves. Or there's other ways where at the death of the master that his slaves would automatically be freed even if he didn't have a will, that they would automatically be freed, or that there would be a certain time period, like the child of a slave was automatically free. So in other words, generationally, eventually they would all be free, or even a certain number after a number of years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, the slave would be free. So they're kicking around all these different ideas, and a lot of states in the North did this, and the states in the South, they were moving towards this. And unfortunately, what happens is the invention of the cotton gin. Civic virtue. This is the vocab term from the last couple chapters, really, and it's the idea that democracy depends on the unselfish commitment of each citizen to the public good. And the idea is that if you're going to let people run the government by voting in the people in the office, then they have to vote in good people. They have to vote in people who aren't just out to make money or give power to the people voting for them. So obviously, this is hypothetical and it doesn't exist in real life. Then here is the vocab term Republican motherhood. This vocab term was probably glossed over by most history teachers forever, and then it becomes the main topic of a DBQ from, I think it was 2005, and everybody across the country freaked out. So just in case it comes up in an essay or a multiple choice question, here's what you have to know. Republican motherhood is the idea that women during this late colonial, early country were elevated. And what I mean by elevated is that their status raises just a little bit because they're given the important role of the keepers of the nation's conscience. And since they are the ones that are going to be the primary educators of their sons, and the sons are going to be the ones that grow up to actually have jobs in the government, then these mothers need to have proper education, especially in reading, writing, and this notion of civic virtue, so they can pass on these talents to their sons. So again, when we talk about women in American history, until fairly recently, there's not a whole lot to talk about, and so the College Board really struggles on how do you provide questions from the colonial time period, from the late 1700s, from the first half of the 1800s on women. And one of the ways they do that is through this Republican motherhood idea. These state constitutions. The whole idea of a constitution is a fairly new development in world history. We've got to remember this is the time period where even legislatures were a fairly new idea. But legislatures around the world, especially in Britain, in Parliament, they would pass a law, and if they didn't like it, then they could pass a new law in the next session or the next year, and it would replace the old law. So you had this constant turnover of hierarchy of laws. And it was whoever was in charge of the parliament or the legislature at that time could basically abuse the powers of any type of minority or party that was out of office at the time, because they could just keep passing laws. So there was this push for how do we come up with a supreme law, a law that is derived from natural elements, whether it be God, whether it be from the people, or whatsoever. And so they come up with the idea of a constitution that the legislature can't change unless through extreme measures. And so most of the states in the founding of our country created these state constitutions, which were meant to be superior to any type of law that the state governments would then later on pass. Most of these state constitutions included a Bill of Rights, and they looked a lot like our federal Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about later. A lot of the states in their constitutions provided for the annual election of legislators, which means that they had to campaign and be elected or re-elected every single year. And it was meant to keep these legislators very tied to the whims, the ideas, the motivations, the desires of the people. You got to remember that we hated King George. We hated the idea of a monarchy. We hated the idea of these arbitrary admiralty judges. And so the states that had executives, they were very weak, and the judicial branches were also very weak. So most states had three branches of government, but by far the legislative branch was the most powerful. Okay, so why was the American Revolution different than the French Revolution? American on American violence was very limited, very, very low scale. Even the violence against the British at the end of the day was fairly low scale. And then if you look at the French Revolution, it's just the opposite. Hundreds of thousands of people are executed. And it's French on French violence. The midget Napoleon seizes power, he becomes dictator, and he basically declares war on the entire earth. Why didn't the American Revolution turn into that? Most historians say it's because you had a very short amount of history for America, where you had over 1,000 years of history for the French. So there's a lot of hostility that can be built up. You had class warfare occur in France, and it doesn't occur in America because of the notion of cheap and or free land. Right? The poor didn't need to steal or seize the land of the wealthy for any type of perceived grievance. They could just move west. And there really was no landed aristocracy. Of course, we have the Jeffersons and the Washingtons and the Adams who are wealthy, but they've only really been around for a few generations. as opposed to these aristocracies in France that had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years and had obliterated the peasants of their village for hundreds and hundreds of years. You just don't have that in America at the time. So in a sense, economic democracy preceded political democracy in America. Another problem with the economics of the situation during this time period is that the state governments, they were the ones that conducted the Revolutionary War. There really was no, we had a Continental Congress, but there was no centralized attack on the British. There was no centralized coordination, despite how hard the Continental Congress tried. What you had were state governments that they would raise their own militias, their own armies, print their own money, contract with other countries for their own military supplies, and essentially fight the British on their own terms. And so these state governments were deep in debt from the war after several years of this war. Because they were printing up all this money, you're adding lots of money to the money supply, which makes inflation very high. So if you have any type of currency, what you could purchase in 1776 would be a much higher cost in 1783. So if you weren't making any new money, you were in dire straits. The Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, they had no solution, and we're going to talk about why they had no solution next, or maybe not. This picture here shows you the purchase of tea in China by American middlemen. Let's see if I can find it here. Here you can see him in the top hat. And the business of tea was very, very big in this time period in America, especially because we were getting rid of the British. Because we hated the British middlemen and the whole Boston Tea Party, British East India Tea Company debacle. Okay, so here we go. Some problems under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is our first constitution. It's Constitutional 1.0. And the biggest problem that the Articles of Confederation were able to solve at this time, because they did solve a bunch of issues with our country, was Western lands. You may recall that almost every single colony, they had no hard set western boundary. They all basically claimed that they owned land from the Atlantic Ocean to wherever the Pacific Ocean might be, and also lands to the far north and to the south of where their current borders were. So Virginia actually claimed large portions of the Great Lakes region and even Illinois and Chicago, even though we didn't exist yet. So technically the colony of Virginia thought that they owned us. But so did Maryland, so did Massachusetts, so did New York. Right? All these colonies had western land claims, and they all conflicted with each other. So under the Articles of Confederation, in order to agree to a peaceful union, each state, now I guess we'll call them states, agreed to give up their western lands to the federal government. And the federal government then would control who got what as far as these lands. And each colony is admitted and becomes a state on equal terms with all others. So even though Rhode Island was minuscule in size and in population, it had the same power in this union as mighty Virginia or Massachusetts. Here's a map of our first boundaries, and you can see here these western lands, including Chicago and Illinois, all claimed by Virginia. You can see it's overlapped, and you got parts that are claimed by Massachusetts and Connecticut and Virginia again. They got North Carolina's claiming large portions over here, South Carolina over here. You can see that there was a dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania over here. You got New Hampshire. Notice how you don't even see Vermont. That's because they had like a mini civil war, and Vermont essentially seceded from New Hampshire. Then you got this border. Well, we're in the Revolutionary War, but the dispute between Maine and Canada / Britain at the time. So you have lots of border disputes happening here. What was the structure of government under the Articles of Confederation? Well, there wasn't any three branches of government. There was a one branch of government, and that was Congress. In this Congress, and it was a unicameral Congress, meaning it was just one house, each state had one vote. So no matter what, Rhode Island had one vote, Virginia had one vote. If it was an important bill, so a bill basically involving any type of international or major domestic matters, you had to have 9 of the 13 states agree to it. So not a simple majority. This was, you had to have a pretty large supra majority here. And in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, what you had to have is a unanimous vote, a unanimous agreement by all 13 states. So that makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to amend this first constitution in America. There is no executive branch, there is no judicial branch, although there were courts, but the courts were in the states. So a court within Massachusetts may settle a dispute between two parties involving the Articles of Confederation. Biggest problem under the Articles of Confederation is that Congress had no power to regulate commerce whatsoever. So all of the setting of taxes, tariffs, and whatnot, that was all left up to the states. And so the states actually set up their own tariffs on foreign imports, which basically meant that they were competing against each other to get foreign goods to come to their port. So you have a state like South Carolina, which has a major port in Charleston. You have a state in Massachusetts, which has a major port in Boston. They were essentially competing against each other to get French goods shipped to their state. And so what they would do is they would lower the tariff against each other. And so it was like a reverse bidding war, and essentially they're screwing themselves out of tax money. So that was a major problem. Another problem is that Congress couldn't enforce any type of tax collection. All it could do was set a quota for each state. So, all right, Virginia, you owe the federal government $1 million this year. Massachusetts, you owe $1 million. Connecticut, you owe $500,000. And they would just basically beg the states to fulfill this quota. And of course, the states did not fulfill this quota. Right? Most years, when the Articles of Confederation, the states either gave no money to the federal government or very, very little. So you can see the problem here, that this union is very, very loose, and this federal government is very, very weak. There's Independence Hall in Philadelphia. This is where the Constitution is later debated, signed, all that good stuff. Here are two major laws that you can almost guarantee that you are going to be tested on, that occur during the time period where the Articles of Confederation are the supreme law of the land. The first one is the Land Ordinance of 1785. And it provided that land in the Old Northwest, so that would be kind of the Great Lakes region, should be sold, and the money should go to paying off the national debt, so the debt incurred by the federal government. So these were federal lands that would be sold, and the money to pay off the national debt. The first thing, though, and this is the kind of thing that the College Board really likes to hone in on and test you about, is that they sent out surveyors, and that they would basically analyze this land, break it up into squares, 1/16 of a mile each square, and in these plots of 16 parts, that one of those parts should be sold, and that money should go not for paying off the debt, but to go to finance and create a public school system in this area, which is revolutionary in that really nowhere on earth was a government-funded public school system in place at the time. The other law, which also deals with these western federal territories, is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And it dealt with how a territory becomes a state. Because remember, you had these 13 original states, and for the most part, they had lots of disputes with each other. And now, how are you going to add a 14th, a 15th, a 16th state? And so they set out this process where initially the territory was just run by the federal government. After a territory within specific boundaries had 60,000 people living in it, then they would hold a convention, they would draft their own constitution, and if it contained all the stuff that was required by the federal government, then it would be admitted as a new state with all the privileges and all of the benefits of all the other states. Now this is unique in that a lot of states like Virginia, which had been around for a long time, they really would look down their noses at these Western hillbillies. And there was a lot of pushback on whether or not a new state should be admitted in on the same level with the same privileges as these old states. But it was smart because you could really see that if they didn't, that there probably would have been a civil war in the early 1800s. Instead of North versus South, the Civil War would have been West versus East, where the West were trying to seize rights that they didn't obtain. Because think about all the rebellions that have occurred in the 1600s with Bacon's Rebellion, and then you get Shays' Rebellion, which is this chapter, and the Whiskey Rebellion, which is the next chapter, the Regulator Movement, the Green Mountain Boys. There's all these rebellions, and it's almost always hillbillies out west who don't feel that they're getting a fair shake from the coastal aristocracy out east, so they grab their guns, they march east, and they stir some stuff up. Well, that just would have kept on occurring at a larger and larger scale until you would have had a blown out civil war. Another big thing about the Northwest Ordinance is that it forbids slavery in the Old Northwest. Now you're probably thinking, wow, that's a pretty important thing, especially because why would southern states agree to this? You have to remember that in 1787, slavery was dying out everywhere, and so southern plantation owners, who would have been the delegates that would have voted for this in the Confederation Congress, it was no big thing. They just assumed, well, of course, that there's not going to be slavery in the Old Northwest. Not only can you not plant tobacco in that area, you can't plant cotton in that area, and really, no one is using slaves to a great degree anymore at this time. So the difference between 1787 and 1808 is drastic as far as the South's viewpoints towards the expansion of slavery. Because really, one of the main causes of the Civil War was Western lands and whether or not that slavery could expand to new Western lands. And the South fought that tooth and nail and eventually seceded once the candidate is elected president who was in favor of declaring all federal Western lands free for all time, that being Abraham Lincoln. This is just a map of how the Northwest Ordinance operated, and you can see there that it's all broken up into nice squares and surveyed, and then you can see that section 16 here is reserved for school funds. How exciting. Alright, so in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, how did the rest of the world look at America? Well, we were everybody's ugly duckling. They didn't treat America with any respect, and it was basically the entire world. Britain flat out declined any sort of commercial treaty with us whatsoever, even though they were, prior to the war, our largest trading partners under the mercantilist system. So that drastically hurt American shipping. They also maintained a series of trading posts with Indians on U.S. soil and had small forts filled with British soldiers still on U.S. soil. So that was definitely an affront to our sovereignty. Spain, even though that they were our ally during the Revolutionary War, shortly after the war, they basically changed their minds and become, I don't want to say an enemy, but hostile to our economic claims. Specifically, they controlled the Louisiana area, and they closed the Mississippi River to any type of American commerce. So if you were a farmer that wanted to use the Mississippi River to ship your goods into the Caribbean and then elsewhere, you flat out just couldn't do it because the Spanish would stop your boats. They also claimed a large area of the southeast, in western Florida, which later, the coastal Alabama and Arkansas nowadays, in like the panhandle of Florida, they claimed. The problem is that we also claimed it, so we had disputing land claims in the south there. France, our old ally, they demanded repayment of the money that they loaned us during the Revolutionary War, and we couldn't repay it because we didn't have any money, because who were we going to get money from, because we're even worse in debt. And so as a result, they restricted trade in the West Indies. So we're having a hard time doing trade with Britain, our old trading partner, and the people that we used to smuggle with, the French in the West Indies, now they're restricting trade. The worst, though, is that there were these Arab pirates in North Africa that basically controlled the places that are nowadays known as Libya and Tunisia and Egypt and all those places, they had these Muslim pirates that would just capture American ships and steal our stuff and then enslave our sailors. Now, when we used to be in the British Empire, the British would fight these pirates, and when they didn't fight them, they would actually basically bribe these pirate leaders to let our ships go. Well, Britain's not going to pay their bribes for American ships, and we didn't have really any navy whatsoever. So any type of American shipping that veered anywhere close to Africa or the southern Mediterranean was at definite risk of just being abducted by these Arab pirates. This is a map showing British forces on American soil. There's Fort Niagara there. There's Detroit. There's Fort, I can't even pronounce that, Michilimackinac. Then you also see Spanish claims. Their closing of the Mississippi River at St. Louis, and also Natchez and New Orleans, and also the territory there that they claimed that they owned that we also claimed. The states did not get along in the 1780s. They still fought over northern, southern, western boundaries over each other. In fact, there were very, very small scale violent battles where you would have border disputes, and Massachusetts would come to blows with Connecticut, and North Carolina would come to blows with Virginia. And you'd have, people were dying over these, where was the boundary of these two states. States would actually put tariffs on imports from other states. So it's bad enough that you don't have a unified tariff tax system on foreign imports, but you'd have situations where Virginia would put a tax on North Carolina goods, and vice versa. So there was really no way that you could do business because you had to pay taxes every time you crossed a state border. In addition to that, the states all printed their own paper currency. So how are you going to conduct business where states only accept their own currency and not each other's? And how do you know that $1 in Virginia, what's that's going to be worth if they do accept it, or if you try and exchange it for money in a place like New York? The exchange rates, they didn't exist and they didn't work. It was basically however much you could get for it, that's what you got for it. So it was an absolute mess. And this brings us to Shays' Rebellion, 1786. I kind of alluded to this. This happens in western Massachusetts. Remember, all these rebellions start in the western portion of their respective states. And in this case, you have poor western Massachusetts farmers. Sounds like Bacon's Rebellion so far. Here you have their veterans, not all of them, but many of them were veterans of the Revolutionary War. And they got paid in continentals, right? Useless paper currency during the Revolutionary War. And no one would take their continentals because they weren't worth anything. And so they had to get loans to purchase their farms. And so then if you have a loan to purchase real estate, it's called a mortgage, and you have to make regular payments on your mortgage. Well, they couldn't make these payments. And so these banks, who had lots of financial difficulties for all the reasons that we talked about, the tariffs, the paper money, the trade restrictions, all that other stuff, they start calling in these loans, meaning they want these mortgages paid. These farmers didn't have the money to pay them, and the banks weren't accepting these useless continentals. So Daniel Shays grabs his gun, grabs his buddies out there in western Massachusetts, and they basically march on the Massachusetts legislature out east in Philadelphia. And what did they want? They wanted paper money that they could use to repay their debts. They wanted lower taxes, and they wanted a stoppage of these foreclosures of their farms. It's funny because these are very similar claims in the current recession that property owners made. In our own Tom Dart, Cook County Sheriff, he actually stopped the property takeovers, these foreclosures by the Cook County Police because of it. So he was basically following the leadership of Daniel Shays and what Shays' Rebellion wanted 200 years ago. So it's kind of odd there. So what happens with the people who are out east? Well, the wealthy, they're the ones that own the stock in these banks. They're the ones that are foreclosing on these properties. They hire a small mercenary army to defend themselves. So you have farmers who are going to fight now mercenaries. It's American on American. So this is getting ugly quick. And so quickly, the closer that Shays and his followers got to Philadelphia, the more laws that the Massachusetts legislature passed to appease Daniel Shays. So they start passing debtor relief laws, in other words, stopping these property takeovers. And it really strikes a fear amongst the wealthy of class warfare. The poor are going to rise up and steal all or kill all the rich people and their stuff. And after this rebellion dissolves and gets put down, there's a lot of calls, especially from the conservative class, the wealthy class, um, that they needed to create something, some form of government that would prevent future rebellions or to better defend against future rebellions. And that idea manifests itself in a stronger central government. So this is another picture from her book. It's basically like a political cartoon from 1787 about a debtor complaining about taxes. So this would be a Western farmer with the rake here and a bottle of whiskey, and it's basically saying that it takes this tax collector, the government is taking all of his property away, and it just reflects this discontent that these Western farmers had to the Eastern aristocracy and how they were, rising up in rebellion. Okay, so a bunch of the founding fathers, including Alexander Hamilton, who was a young guy during the Revolution, they convince the states to send delegates, although Rhode Island didn't go, under the guise of revising the Articles of Confederation to fix these problems that the Articles had. There were some heavy hitters there. George Washington was there, and he was elected chairman. Remember, after the Revolutionary War, George Washington just kind of rode off into the sunset, and most of America wanted him to be king or be this new, kind of leader of the country, and he just went back to Mount Vernon, his farm, and kind of chilled out for about 5 years or so. An ancient Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old, senile as hell, shows up at this convention in Philadelphia. James Madison from Virginia. Alexander Hamilton, who's now got a little bit of age on him, is a very, very wealthy, prominent lawyer from the New York area. But many of the guys from the Revolutionary era were not involved in this convention. Thomas Jefferson was in France at the time. John Adams was out of the country in Britain at the time. Thomas Paine didn't go. Sam Adams didn't go. John Hancock didn't go. Patrick Henry didn't go. So you have a lot of the main guys from the Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 who were not involved with this Constitutional Convention in 1787, but 55 delegates did go. So it was basically just a plan by Alexander Hamilton and also James Madison to scrap the Articles of Confederation. They didn't work. And so very early on, they said, all right, we're not going to revise the Articles. We're just going to draft a new Constitution, a Constitution 2.0. And there was a bunch of disputes and a bunch of negotiations that had to take place. And the biggest one was probably how the power of the states in relation to one another in the legislative branch of the government. So the Virginia Plan, which is also called the Large State Plan, it envisioned two houses, so a bicameral Congress, and representation in both houses would have been based on population. So states such as Virginia, which had the very large population at the time, would have been able to sway legislation towards their desires. New Jersey, on their hand, came up with a small state plan, and it's no surprise New Jersey didn't have a whole lot of people living there, and they envisioned a unicameral Congress, so one house, and very similar to the Articles of Confederation, each state would have equal representation in this house. We come to the Great Compromise. And under the Great Compromise, you have a bicameral Congress, a House of Representatives and a Senate. The House of Representatives is represented by population, so the larger states have a larger voice in the House of Representatives. The Senate, which would be the upper house, you have equal representation, so 2 votes per state. Because at the end of the day, the larger states are giving up more in this compromise, every tax bill or revenue bill must originate in the House. It's cut off there at the bottom. But so any bill that involves raising money for the federal government, taxing the people, had to originate in the aspect of the House, in this case to be the House of Representatives, that was most closely tied to the people who would actually have to pay these taxes. So that's why it's the House of Representatives. The executive branch. Unlike the Articles of Confederation, Constitution 2.0 provided for an executive branch, and he would be called the President. The President had the power to make appointments to domestic offices, including judgeships. So one of the checks that the President had over the legislative branch is he could veto any type of legislation, although that was extremely rarely used. The first time I believe it was used was Andrew Jackson, and then it wasn't used very often after that. Nowadays it's used all the time. Another power of the President is Commander-in-Chief. So the President has the power to wage war. Commander-in-Chief, you're basically the head general. You get to make the final military decisions. However, Congress, the legislative branch, gets to retain the power to declare war. So under the Constitution, the President couldn't conduct a war until Congress actually declared war on somebody. They were very wary of any type of democratic tyranny where the majority would just pick some demigod as their president. And so in the Constitution, they had the president elected indirectly by an electoral college. And this electoral college, the delegates, would have been chosen by the state legislatures. So there was a couple barriers between the voters and the executive. So, and that's retained to this day. The president every 4 years is not elected by popular vote, not elected by people over the age of 18. He is elected by an electoral college. The slavery issue. This was hotly debated that summer in Philadelphia. The South was still unwilling to give up slavery, although they knew that it was dying. The North wanted to get rid of slavery. So they basically punt to the next generation and say, all right, we'll all be dead or retired in 20 years, so why don't we let the next generation of politicians deal with the slave issue? So for now, in the Constitution, you cannot abolish the slave trade until 1807. And pretty much everybody figured that it would almost be a non-issue at that point afterwards. The South, though, even though they wanted to retain slavery, they wanted to count their slaves as citizens, I guess you'd say, for purposes of determining the population of their state. Because in the House of Representatives, you got more representatives in the government based on the population. So if a state had 1 million people, it's going to have more representatives in the government than a state who has 500,000 people. Should have twice as many, right? So the North said, well, okay, South, if you want to count your slaves for population purposes, then free them, and then they can vote and they can all this. South's like, whoa, we're not going to do that. So they had to come up with a compromise, and they came up with this odd fraction of 3/5. So a slave counts as 3/5 of one person for population purposes for determining apportionment of both taxes and representation in the House of Representatives. Good luck figuring that one out. This is the famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You can see here's George Washington over here. I think Benjamin Franklin somewhere around. Oh, there he is. There's Benjamin Franklin, probably asking the guy next to him to pull his finger because he was very old and senile. There's a dude with a peg leg. I have no clue who he is. Now, just because that this was a more democratic constitution, you're really involving more and more people into the government. Remember, the point was to create a stronger federal government to protect the moneyed class from the mob. This is a very Zen-like argument, where it was that the Constitution itself is a barrier to socioeconomic advancement by the poor. So what are the safeguards against this mob? First off, federal judges are appointed for life. So since the judges don't have to worry about getting reelected, they don't have to follow the whims of the people. The president is elected indirectly, so the people can't just pick some guy who's going to level, as the term operated back then, of taking money away from the rich and giving it to the poor. The senators weren't chosen by the people at all. Much like the Electoral College, senators, so half of the legislature, was chosen by state legislatures. And as far as the House of Representatives, at the end of the day, it was only propertied white males who got to vote for the House of Representatives. So a very, very small portion of federal office holders were actually elected by the people, and even then, the people was a very small element of the total population. So then, the convention is over. These delegates go back to their respective states, and now they have to have conventions in these states. So basically, a special election in each one of the states is to determine who the delegates are going to be on these conventions, and then, of course, vote on whether or not to adopt this new constitution. And a lot of people didn't like this constitution. They thought it was too much of a seizure of power by a federal government. They didn't like the idea of an executive. The idea of a arbitrary king and a rich aristocracy was still too recent in their memories with the battles that they had with Britain and all the problems with the landed gentry in Europe. And so they become the anti-federalists. The Federalists, on the other hand, wanted the strong government. They wanted adoption of the Constitution. So here is the issue, too. The Articles of Confederation, you'll recall, required unanimous ratification of amending the Articles. And since Rhode Island didn't send anybody even to this convention, you were pretty much guaranteed that Rhode Island would veto, in other words, not vote for amending the Articles of Confederation. So the delegates basically pulled a fast one. And they stated that, hey, as long as 9 states adopt this new constitution, then it's in effect. Another name for this would be illegal. To this day, those crazy militia types that don't want to pay federal taxes and think that the federal government is conducting all these crimes against them, one of their main arguments is that the Constitution doesn't exist, that we're still operating under the Articles of Confederation because it was never unanimously adopted by the 13 states at the time. Now, a contrary argument to this would be, at the end of the day, Rhode Island finally does come around, and all of the states end up adopting this Constitution at the end of the day. But the whole notion that only 9 had to adopt initially smacks of illegality, and they're right. I mean, under the Articles, which was our Constitution, you couldn't do this, and they did it anyway. So once again, the Anti-Federalists opposed to a strong federal government. And the only way that they were swayed, and not all of them were swayed, is that the first Congress, the Federalists promised that the first Congress would pass a Bill of Rights, which would protect both states' rights and individual rights from arbitrary infringement by the federal government. This is just a table showing kind of a comparison, contrast of the Articles of Confederation and the Federal Constitution. The whole idea of the Articles of Confederation is you had a compact between the states, that the states agreed to form a union, whereas under the Constitution, it's the people, not the states, that formed the union. The legislature on the Articles had 1 vote per state, and then it's broken up by, the Senate 2 votes per state, and then by population in the House of Representatives. You can see here for important measures, you needed 9 out of 13 under the Articles, and a simple majority in Congress. No congressional powers of commerce, where Congress got the Commerce Clause, which we'll talk about in chapters to come, and so on and so forth. You can look at that later. So here is the hotbed of Federalist and Anti-Federalist concerns. And so you can see in certain states, right? Like North Carolina, South Carolina. You got lots of anti-federalists. You got a ton of anti-federalists here in New York as well. And you can see the vote ends up being really close, 30 to 27. In Virginia, it tends to be, I guess, not so close. Another close vote here in Massachusetts, 187 to 168. Look at Rhode Island, 34 to 32, and it's actually in 1790. So the government had actually been in effect for a while. Okay, so 4 states at the end of the day hadn't adopted yet by, I don't know, 1788. And so Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and ironically James Madison. And the reason why I say ironically is James Madison eventually becomes one of the founding members of the Democratic Republicans, which was based on former anti-federalists. But at this time, in 1788, James Madison is a Federalist. They write a number of articles in pamphlets and newspapers, especially in New York, which had that very close vote in 1788, as to why the convention should adopt the Constitution. The most famous one of these Federalist papers is Federalist Number 10, which you will read in class, and it states that it's better to have a republican form of government and a large territory to control factions. And we'll analyze that in great detail in class. Here's ratification. You can see Rhode Island is at the very end. North Carolina with all those anti-federalists were at the very end also. The two big ones, the two biggest concerns were Virginia and New York. Those were very, very important states, and if they wouldn't have adopted it, then you could have almost had two countries at that point. This is just a political cartoon at the time, discussing the adoption of the Constitution. And here's our last slide. The chronology here, 1774, you get the first Congressional Congress. 1777, the Articles of Confederation are adopted by the Second Continental Congress. You get all these state constitutions that start being adopted during this time period. 1785, you get the Land Ordinance. 1786, you get Shays' Rebellion. 1787, you get the Northwest Ordinance and the Constitutional Convention. And then the following year, you get the final ratification by the requisite 9 states to start a new government.